Hey everybody, this is the Translator's introduction to a book titled Philosophy of the Encounter, Later Writings 1978 to 1987 by Louis Althusser, edited by Francois Matterrand and Olivier Corpet, translated with an introduction by a G.M. Goshgarian. The reason I'm reading this is because it's cited in the book itself is cited in the bibliography for Marx Worldwide by Jan Hoff. And I'm trying to get a feel for Marx reception since 1965, which is the year that Jan Hoff's book starts at. So, here we are. Translator's Introduction, in memory of Constance Coiner, 1948 to 1996. Section 1. Philosophy of Encounter collects nearly all the philosophical work that Louis Althusser produced from late 1977 to the year he stopped producing philosophy, 1987. The main texts in it, Marx and His Limits and The Underground Current of the Materialism of the Encounter, date respectively from 1978 to 79 and 1982 to 83. Between them lies an abyss. In one sense, in 1980, overtaken by the psychosis that stalked him down to his death a decade later, Althusser killed his wife Helene Reitman and nothing in another, titled The Underground Current. Rather, the amorphous manuscript out of which Francois Matterrand has skillfully carved it was the first piece of any note to come from Althusser's pen after he laid Marx and His Limits aside. A remark of Lenin's that Althusser last invoked in 1975 pinpoints the premise of his philosophical project until then. Quote, if Marx did not leave behind him a, quote, logic, capital L logic, he did leave behind him the logic of capital, end quote. Marxist philosophy's task was to retrieve this coherent logic contained in the, quote, practical state, end quote, in Marx's chef d'oeuvre, a model of, quote, conceptual rigor, end quote, and, quote, theoretical systematicity, end quote, marred only by an inconsequential flirt with Hegel. The piece, Marx and His Limits, revises the premise and subverts the project, for a reason encapsulated in another Leninist pronouncement that Althusser once dismissed as an enigmatic exclamation, quote, it is impossible completely to understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic, end quote. Lenin. Althusser now contends in sum that Lenin was right about the relation between capital and the logic, and therefore wrong about the logic of capital. Marx did not leave behind him a logic, but rather clashing idealist and materialist logics. Consciously, he espoused the former. Capital, the book, is, quote, an essentially Hegelian work, end quote, whose, quote, method of exposition, coincides with the speculative genesis of the concept, end quote. It aspires to reducing the history of capitalism, quote, to the development in the Hegelian sense, end quote, of the, quote, simple, primitive, original, quote, end quote, form of value. And there's endnotes. God, that's so annoying. I hate endnotes. Footnotes, baby. Footnotes. Oh, good. I don't have to go to the very end of the book. And it's just, yeah. It's just a citation. One whole side of Marx's thought proceeds from his speculative geneticism. Capitalist Hegelianism has its pendant in a teleology of history exemplified by the, quote, famous comments, end quote, in The Poverty of Philosophy, quote, on the hand mill, water mill, and steam mill, which justify the reduction of the dialectic of history to the dialectic generating the successive modes of production, that is, in the last analysis, the different production techniques, end quote, Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. The 1859 preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which draws from this principle of the primacy of the productive forces, a universal theory of human history characterized by its avoidance of, quote, all mention of class struggle, end quote, thus attests not a rare Marxian lapse into pre-Marxist idealism, but the centrality of a persistent idealist strain in Marx. As for his magnum opus, it is not a purely idealist work only because the simple form from which it would deduce all else proves, in theoretical practice, to result from the historical process supposed to proceed from it. Marx cannot account for capital without taking account of class struggle, which the deduction of history from the value form, like that of each mode of production from its predecessor in a hierarchy, quote, requires him to bracket out, end quote. Whence Althusser's deconstructive solution to a classic problem. In the, quote, true heart, end quote, of Capital, its historical chapters, Marx's materialist logic exceeds the idealist ideologic of his overarching scheme, shattering the, quote, fictitious unity, end quote, of the whole. The book owes its success to its failure. A 1982 interview draws the general conclusion, quote, one cannot both be a Marxist and coherent, end quote. Althusser. The article, The Underground Current, takes that conclusion as its premise. Rather than try to derive a philosophy from Marx's incoherency, Althusser now undertakes to produce a philosophy for Marx, that is, against the idealist Marx and in the aleatory materialist stead. Althusser seeks, quote, the premises of Marx's materialism, end quote, where he noted in 1975 that lay buried in a tradition binding, quote, Epicurus to Spinoza, end quote, and Hegel to whom, quote, Marx was close, end quote, the reluctant Spinozist of a philosophical current that is, quote, hardly ever mentioned, end quote. Quote, the article, The Underground Current, reconstructs the history of this repressed, quote, materialism of the encounter, end quote, renamed, quote, aleatory materialism, unquote, by 1986, ignoring Hegel while including Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, and others. His survey, Althusser announces near the end of it, is, quote, just a prelude, end quote, to what he, quote, wanted to call attention to in Marx, end quote. He produces little more than the prelude. Quote, the article, Marx and His Limits, however, has already distilled the essence of what he would have said if he had. Quote, that Marx's thought contains, on the question of historical necessity, end quote, both, quote, extremely original suggestions that have nothing to do with the mechanism of inevitability, end quote, and just the opposite. It is not hard to show that Althusser's exposure of Marx's incoherencies exposes Althusser's own. Indeed, our summary of his 1978 indictment of the idealist Marx has done precisely that. It is a patchwork of indignant Althusserian rebuttals of the charge that Marx was a Hegelian. From For Marx, published in 1965, to the 1975 article, Is It Simple to Be a Marxist in Philosophy?, one finds dozens of similar, earlier Althusserian denials of Marxist Hegelianism, easily convertible through negation of the negation in Freud's sense, not Hegel's, into later Althusserian proofs of it. Manifestly, this is evidence of a startling reversal of position. The question is whether it does not also betray an underlying continuity. The last substantial item In this book, Philosophy of the Encounter, quote, titled Philosophy and Marxism, accompanied by extracts from Althusser's correspondence about the text, suggests or embodies an answer to this question. First published without the correspondence in Spanish translation in 1988, this primer of the Philosophy of the Encounter poses as an interview. But it is no such thing. As the quote interviewer, Fernanda Navarro, has hinted by embedding, toward the end, a replica of the article Portrait of the Materialist Philosopher, Althusser's last philosophical text and the coda to the present volume, and near the beginning the Portrait of the Materialist Philosopher that graces his 1965 introduction to For Marx. She has fashioned a picture of Althusser's thought out of passages or paraphrases of the writing he produced in between, pieced together with material from their conversations of the 1980s. Footnote. Oh, never mind. Far from diminishing the value of Fernanda Navarro's quote, pseudo-interview, as Althusser unabashedly described her collage shortly before enthusiastically authorizing its publication, this cut-and-paste work grounds it. For the article, Philosophy and Marxism proposes, by way of its form, a thesis its co-authors surely wanted us to consider. That Althusser's late work does not refute his earlier work even when it contradicts it, but reveals patterns once invisible in it, not by repeating but by transforming them. Section 2. Althusser presents the materialism of the encounter under another name in a March 1976 lecture titled The Transformation of Philosophy. Its subject is a, quote, new practice of philosophy, unquote, defined against that of the, quote, party of the state, end quote. The philosophical practice of the party of the state consists in fictitiously unifying the whole range of social practices under its hegemonic capital T truth. It does so on behalf of a ruling ideology, thereby helping it to dominate the distinct ideology of the ruled. To bring out its commanding position in the philosophical tradition, Althusser calls this state philosophy simply, quote, philosophy. Althusser calls aleatory materialism, quote, non-philosophy, end quote, a term patterned after Engels' description of the proletarian state as a, quote, non-state, end quote. Thus he introduces aleatory materialism, a term we shall use from now on to designate its Althusserian variant, as the non-philosophy of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Between the article, The Transformation of Philosophy, and what the composition of Philosophy of the Encounter suggests was a turn or Kehre, capital K-E-H-R-E, parenthesis, Antonio Negri, end parenthesis, charted in the apparently prophetic letter placed at its head, initiated in the article Marx and His Limits, and negotiated in the article The Underground Current, Althusser led a fight for working-class dictatorship, an idea the Communist Party of France was then retiring from its theoretical arsenal. The article Marx and His Limits is a summa of his pleas for keeping it. This defense of the non-state leads on in the present volume to his plea for non-philosophy. The whole book can accordingly be read as the realization of the program laid out in the 1976 lecture. In fact, Althusser's aleatory materialist turn did not come with the passage from the article Marx and His Limits to the article The Underground Current, which constitutes a record of the Kehre, that same word, K-E-H-R-E, only in the sense that it stages a reenactment of it. If Althusser's turn can be dated at all, That is, if Althusser's thought as a whole is not traversed by an aleatory materialist current, countered by his own, quote, theoreticist, end quote, compromises with the philosophical party of the state, then it occurred not in 1983 but 10 years before. It was rung in by the 1969 manuscript Sur la Reproduction, a theorization of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie that is unmistakably a prototype of the article Marx and His Limits. It was carried out in a pair of fragmentary unpublished books, Livre sur le communisme of 1972 and Livre sur l'impérialisme 1973, which formulate basic concepts of the materialism of the encounter and thus constitute a kind of prototype of the article The Underground Current. When one adds that the 1972-73 manuscripts elaborate elements of a, quote, theory of the encounter, end quote, that Althusser sketched in 1966, that he undertook around 1973, a study of the ancient atomists, which soon saw them promoted to the rank of Marx's, quote, most important, albeit, quote, indirect ancestors, and that he rehearsed his 1970s battle with the party in the 1960s, it appears that the lesson of, quote, of the article Philosophy and Marxism can be transcribed in another historical philological key. The late work is, in many respects, quite literally a transformation of Althusser's philosophy, a critical rewriting of earlier, often much earlier work. To mistake the years in which aleatory materialism took provisionally final form for its only content is, therefore, to endow it with a fictive genealogy, one the late Althusser, to be sure, helped to invent. As for the creative transformation of Althusser's philosophy, wrought by the Anglophone consensus, to the effect that he countenanced or even welcomed his party's rejection of working-class dictatorship, it would be uncharitable not to ignore it, but the record should be set straight. Section 3. From the early 1960s on, the Communist Party of France's leadership was wedded to the thesis that the French road to socialism ran through the ballot box. Because the party had, since the war, never polled more or much less than a quarter of the national vote, reason seemed to dictate that it had to forge electoral alliances with other left parties because it dwarfed them all. It could, the assumption ran, easily dominate its prospective allies. In 1965, this strategy spawned a communist-socialist electoral pact around the socialist François Mitterrand's bid to unseat de Gaulle. Encouraged by his respective showing, the Communist Party of France's leaders assiduously sought, in the years thereafter, to put the nascent communist-socialist, quote, unity of the left, end quote, on the foundations of a common governmental program. They succeeded in the aftermath of May 1968. The program Commune was signed with the socialists and another small party to their right in mid-1972. Its history is a history of socialist success at communist expense. By 1977 at the latest, the cantankerous alliance had unmistakably turned to the advantage of the Communist Party of France's once junior partner. The Socialist Party was certain to emerge from the March 1978 parliamentary elections, which the Union of the Left was widely expected to carry, as the hegemonic left force. Late in 1977, the PCF leadership therefore took a secret decision to sabotage the program Commune, effectively handing the election to the right. For the millions who had been counting on them to ring in the final conflict with French capitalism, the defeat was traumatic. Moreover, it came at a time when communist intellectuals and a section of the party's mid-level leadership were in unprecedented revolt against the famously undemocratic methods of its ruling circle. For these and other reasons, among them the French mass media's timely 1975 discovery of the Gulag, the late 1970s saw thousands of voters desert the party, initiating its precipitous 20th century decline. By 1981, when the socialists swept the presidential and legislative elections, the PCF was already a distinctly minority force on the left. The four secondary ministries it was allotted in Mitterrand's government reflected its subaltern place in the new political pecking order. Althusser was theoretically in favor of a communist-socialist alliance and ferociously opposed to paying the price at which he thought it would come, a swift retreat from the class culminating in communist rejection of the dictatorship of the proletariat, effectively accomplished in 1976. His verdict on the Programme Commune, handed down in a 1973 conversation with a communist potentate, Roland Leroy, reflected this opposition, the grail that, as party leaders saw it, vindicated a decade of earnest questioning, was, he told Leroy, quote, a lure and a, quote, paper lure at that, unquote. They spoke a year after the agreement was reached, but Althusser had not waited until 1973 to decry his party's 1976 turn. In the first half of the 1960s, Althusser and his co-thinkers had waged a preventative war against it. One of the PCF's then, quote, official philosopher quite rightly called a, quote, systematic attack on the party's politics led by the group of philosophers influenced by Althusser, unquote. Is that Sev, or whatever his name is, S-E-V? Let's see, footnote. No, Goshgarian. Concretely, the Althusserians targeted the Marxist humanist and Hegelian Marxist philosophies that, by glossing over the themes of class struggle and revolutionary rupture, facilitated a communist marriage with the socialist on the socialist terms. The theoretical jousting escalated into a carefully controlled inter-party organizational battle, capped by a landmark 1966 Central Committee meeting at Argenteuil, where the Althusserians', quote, left-wing anti-Stalinist positions, unquote, were lengthily debated and roundly rejected. The outcome of the clash convinced the principal loser that the PCF, like the CPSU, was, quote, objectively pursuing reformist revisionist policies, unquote, and becoming a, quote, social democratic party, that it had, quote, ceased to be revolutionary, unquote, and was, quote, all but lost, unquote. The proof was that it must soon abandon the dictatorship of the proletariat. Such, at any rate, was the burden of a set of texts that Althusser wrote in the wake of Argenteuil. The PCF had forgotten the lesson of Marx's critique of the Gotha program. He warned in a 1966 letter that he resolved to hand to General Secretary Waldeck Rochet, and warned again in a 1967 polemic aimed at French communism's Marxist humanist intellectuals, quote, for the sake of unity, end quote, with the party of reform, Althusser complained, the PCF was preparing to strike an impossible, quote, compromise between Marxist theory and ideology, end quote. But if the French party was repeating this mistake the German party had made at Gotha, its most prestigious theoretician was not about to repeat Marx's. The PCF's re-edition of the Gotha program, he would oppose his re-edition of Marx's critique, and unlike his illustrious predecessor, see to its publication by the party press before 1966 was out. Intended for an audience of communist activists, the projected book, Socialisme idéologique et Socialisme scientifique, develops a point crucial to Marx's text as well, the idea that compromise on the question of working-class dictatorship inevitably saps the very foundation of revolutionary socialism. The PCF's rejection of this, quote, key concept of Marxist theory, end quote, Althusser would argue in the 1976 text, La Vache Noire, a projected book on class dictatorship intended for the party press and an audience of communist activists, quote, crowned a long-standing tendency, end quote. Althusser meant at one level that the decision to retire the idea had been in the making for a decade and more, as its partisans were happy to agree. But Althusser also meant, as his 1966 evocation of Gotha indicates, and Socialisme idéologique repeats, that it represented something like communism's original sin, an apparently congenital weakness for the deadly illusion that the state is above class, or could or should be. Its susceptibility to this myth, according to Socialisme idéologique, stems ultimately from the inevitable immersion of the workers' movement in a sea of bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology, a situation that engenders the abiding temptation to transform the, quote, scientific notions of historical materialism, end quote, into their ideological travesties, and ensures that, quote, the struggle inside Marxist organizations, end quote, will, quote, last as long as the history of the workers' movement, end quote. The, quote, decisive point at which this transformation makes itself felt, end quote, runs the decisive thesis of the projected book, quote, is the class struggle and dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, quote, the critical point in the whole theoretical and political history of Marxism, end quote. What happens when socialism closes its eyes to it? The sleep of revolutionary reason breeds the reformist dream of a, quote, true classless democracy, end quote. The idea that it is possible to define, quote, democracy without taking democracy's class content into account, end quote. That dream in turn encourages the substitution of a politics of, quote, class collaboration, end quote, for a politics of class struggle. Class collaboration is the practical consequence of the theoretical delusion that the exploited can, quote, reform society while avoiding revolution, end quote, or, quote, put bourgeois society in parentheses in order to create the future in its midst, end quote. Why can they not, at the price of a protracted war of position against their exploiters? Althusser's answer comes by the way of his theorization of the ideological state apparatus. Proposed 3 years later in Sur la reproduction, the short form of it is that ideological state apparatuses are state apparatuses, and as such, like courts, ministries, and death squads, part of the arsenal of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The book contains, by the same token, his rebuttal of the PCF's developing argument for, quote, democratization, end quote, of the capitalist state, later erected into an alternative to working class dictatorship on the basis of a notion of, quote, true democracy, end quote, that the party mobilized in a feeble defense of class dictatorship at Argenteuil. No, I'm saying that right. We shall glance at the theoretical premises of Sur la reproduction in a bit more detail later. Its main practical conclusion, restated in the article Marx and His Limits, speaks for itself. Quote, if one day in our future the Communist Party and its allies find themselves in a position to win a majority in the legislative elections, they will need to bear in mind that without seizing state power, without dismantling the state's repressive apparatus, without a long struggle to smash the bourgeois ideological state apparatuses, revolution is unthinkable, end quote. Althusser. Althusser did not deliver his 1966 letter to the party or publish his other 1960s critiques of the developing Gallic Gotha program, Gallic meaning like French. The exception, the controversial 1970 paper on interpolation and the ideological state apparatuses called from the otherwise posthumously released Sur la reproduction, was not really an exception, since the political intent of the book was lost on the vast audience of the paper, which seemed to most readers to plead the necessity of a long war of position inside the ideological state apparatuses, that is, inside the capitalist state, not as smashing them along with the rest of it in a long post-revolutionary struggle. Thus there was virtually no public record of Althusser's post-Argenteuil bid to forestall French communism's seduction by the sirens of, quote, true classless democracy, end quote. In English, this remains the case. Why did Althusser duck a crucial political theoretical fight? Althusser, quote, felt helpless in the face of realities like the party, end quote. Althusser, quote, felt even more helpless in the face of certain ideological misunderstanding effects, end quote, due to Althusser's status as, quote, a very prestigious personage, end quote, and not least, quote, he was ill, unquote. He says in explanation of Marx's suppression of his critique in the article Marx and His Limits, which, like his previous decryals of his un-Marxist willingness to suppress his polemic, was also suppressed. Yet the later Althusser cannot fairly be accused of continuing to follow Marx's bad example. Witness the second round of his fight for class dictatorship. Section 4. In November 1977, a few months before the legislative elections that the French Communist parties and its allies were expected to carry, Althusser took the floor at a Venice conference organized by Il Manifesto, a far-left group pushed out of the PCI in 1969 to proclaim that Marxism was in crisis. Althusser made his provocative thesis still more provocative by echoing a charge that Italian socialism's leading political philosopher, Norberto Bobbio, had been pressing the harder the closer the PCI and PCF came to power. Marxism did not, quote, have, a theory of the state power, or the state apparatus, end quote. Althusser declared before an audience of socialist and union activists from across Europe and even the USSR, repeating something he had been saying in private for at least a decade. The lack was partly to blame for communism's, quote, tragic history, end quote. One reason it had never been made good, he added, paraphrasing his abortive 1964 book on, quote, The Personality Cult, end quote, was that Stalin had murderously, quote, snuffed out, end quote, the theoretical crisis precipitated by his dogmatism, doing Marx's thought perhaps irreparable damage. Another was a baneful tendency to credit Marxism with the coherency and completeness simulated by Capital's, quote, fictitious theoretical unity, end quote, but belied by the, quote, contradictions and gaps, end quote, that marked the book as they did the rest of Marx's work. This preview of the article, Marx and His Limits, caused the predictable stir. The excitement was kept running at the desired pitch by a follow-up interview published in April in Il Manifesto's daily of the same name. From then until September and beyond, in the context of controversy over the state that had been agitating the Western European left since 1973, Italian, French, and German-speaking socialists replied to Althusser in Il Manifesto and elsewhere. The proceedings of the Venice Conference appeared in Italian, French, and English. The interview and most of the replies were collected in books published in Italy and West Berlin, while a similar debate ran in the French communist journal Dialectique. Thus, the article, Marx and His Limits, if published in its turn, would have come as Althusser's last word in a pan-European discussion, kindled by a sampling of it and raging as he wrote it. In the event, his rejoinder was limited to a few pages on Marxism, included in an Italian encyclopedia in November 1978, pages written before the fight had fairly begun. Its embattled protagonist did not fully substantiate his 1977 charge about the rudimentary nature of the Marxist theory of the state until, quote, Marx and His Limits, end quote, appeared in 1994. Althusser's defense of its rudiments, however, was better developed and already in the public domain. Moreover, Althusser continued, as it were, to press the defense while pursuing the attack, consistently since both advanced the same struggle against the party of the state. The Marx he defended was the one for whom the sole alternative to capitalist dictatorship was working class dictatorship, and the state a set of apparatuses that maintained one to the exclusion of the other. This was the Marx who knew that, quote, the vocation of a communist party is not to, quote, participate, unquote, in government, but to overturn and destroy the power of the bourgeois state, end quote. Indeed, that, quote, the party, for reasons of principle, should, keep out of the proletarian state as well, end quote. And that quote is from extracts from Althusser's Note on Ideological State Apparatuses, 1977. But there was also the Marx who authorized the teleological historiography of the primacy of the productive forces, and with it, a Stalinist or social democratic negation or attention of class struggle. Where was this Marxist theory of the state? It was in the blanks and the others, the blanks that made his rudimentary theory rudimentary, the blanks partly filled in, notably by those famous comments on the hand mill, water mill, and steam mill and the poverty of philosophy, the reductive treatment of the state in Volume 3 of Capital and the notorious 1859 preface, but above all by the Marxian party of the state responsible for the tragic history of communism. It was materialized no less in the political practice of the putatively post-Stalinist communist parties who attempt to distance themselves from their tragic history were hobbled by the ties that firmly bound them to it. One, from Althusser's standpoint, mattered more than all the rest: their rejection of working-class dictatorship. In positive terms, their adhesion to the bourgeois ideology of the, at least potentially, class-neutral state, viceroy of his apolitical majesty, the economy. It was from this, quote, hyper-Leninist, end quote, standpoint, as his communist adversaries saw the matter, combined, in their view, paradoxically, with a, quote, anti-party movementism, end quote, bordering on anarchism, that Althusser led the combat for Marx's position on the state, which alone makes his denunciation of its limits intelligible. Hostilities were opened with Georges Marchais' January 1976 public confession that, in his, quote, personal opinion, end quote, talk of class dictatorship was, quote, outmoded, end quote, in democracies such as modern France. The PCF soon discovered that it was of the same mind as its General Secretary. Its February 22nd Congress duly approved by the usual unanimous vote Marchais' recommendation that the party statutes be purged of all mention of the idea. Formally, execution of the modification was left to the 23rd Congress. In the event, this gave opponents 3 years in which to pursue a quixotic attempt to persuade the rank and file not to take the step. Althusser bent himself to the task. In 1976-77, Althusser pled the case for the dictatorship of the proletariat, not just in the open, but in the limelight, in France and abroad, orally and in print. By mid-1976, his opposition to the turn was public knowledge from Barcelona to Berlin. In Paris, it was common knowledge and front-page news. The riposte to Marchais was launched before the 22nd Congress by Etienne Balibar, acting, the opposing camp not unreasonably assumed, as the avant-garde of a small Althusserian communist army. Its presumed general unequivocally confirms in Les Vaches Noires that he wholeheartedly approved of his younger colleague's forward defense. The public appearance that he began making shortly after the 22nd Congress loudly broadcast the same message, captured and equipped with which he seems to have garnished all of them, disagreeing with the idea of class dictatorship, ran the one-liner borrowed from a stand-up comic, was like disagreeing with the law of gravity. The first of these talks, if we do not count his 1976 lecture on, quote, non-philosophy, delivered in Barcelona and Madrid, was given in Paris in April. Prevented by interference from the party's upper echelons from speaking on the 22nd Congress at the invitation of the Sorbonne's Communist Student Organization, the PCF's best-known philosopher capitalized on an invitation to its April book fair to present, along with his new book, Positions, his stand on the dictatorship of the proletariat. He shared the podium with Lucien Sèvres, the party's leading Euro-communist philosopher and the leading proponent of its turn. A year later, at a presentation of Les Communistes et l'État, a semi-official apology for the PCF's move by Sèvres and 2 others, he presented it again, this time in a reply to the authors that he made from the floor, to wild cheering from a throng of young supporters. In the interim, in July 1976, Althusser returned to Barcelona and Madrid to deliver a long lecture on the theory of working-class dictatorship, inspiring a hostile Spanish commentator to reflect on the inordinate indulgence that the PCF was showing in not expelling him. He even managed, after stubborn effort, to deliver his Sorbonne lecture to the Communist Student Organization in December, despite the party establishment's last-ditch effort to foil this, quote, veiled factional attack, end quote, by denouncing its cancellation, and after braving a hail of leaflets unleashed by stalwarts of the, quote, line of the 22nd Congress, end quote. Althusser was a, quote, theoretical personage whose every word counted, end quote. As the article Marx and His Limits says of Marx, the events just mentioned drew crowds thousands strong. The April 1976 lecture was reported in detail in the PCF's Daily, which printed a surprisingly full-fare account of Althusser's argument to the effect that no socialist revolution could succeed without, quote, smashing the bourgeois state apparatus and replacing it with a revolutionary one, end quote. The book fair talk also provoked an oral assault by Marché after Althusser had left. Quote, do you want to abolish elections? Why cling to dogmas that are dead in our eyes, end quote. A revised version of his Sorbonne lecture was issued as a short book in May 1977, more diplomatically worded than his other indictments of the party's move, probably so as to seem a little less like a veiled factional attack. It too makes no secret of its author's conviction that the object of revolutionary politics is to seize state power and then, quote, democratize its apparatuses by dismantling them. His July Madrid-Barcelona lecture, for its part, yielded a long text placed at the head of a 1978 Spanish collection of his writings, the main lines of Althusser's discussion of class dictatorship in the article Marx and His Limits, down to the concluding analysis of the antinomies of Gramsci's theory of hegemony, all sketched in it. In a word, by the time he sat down to write the article Marx and His Limits, Althusser had said and published enough against the prevailing PCF line to convince observers such as the sociologist Alain Touraine that he had become, quote, the leader, perhaps despite himself, of a left opposition at the heart of the PCF, end quote. He had written enough to justify the same judgment 2 years later. Had Les Vaches Noires been published as planned early in his campaign around the dictatorship of the proletariat, it would have sufficed to set Althusser up as what Touraine believed he had become towards the end of it, quote, the source and potential leader of a, quote, alternative to the PCF's present politics, end quote. So at any rate, thought Balibar, who advised against the text release on the grounds that it would thrust Althusser into an oppositional role, which he lacked the, quote, means and inter-party support to sustain. He might fairly have said the same thing about the article Marx and His Limits, or, for that matter, Socialisme idéologique. Every thesis is a counter-thesis, Althusser affirms, which suggests that before we say a word about the positions he was defending in the essay Marx and His Limits, we should touch on those he was defending them against. The better known require no summary. Denouncing the, quote, trick theater, end quote, of the theorists of, quote, force pure and alone, end quote, Marx and His Limits, or the essay Marx and His Limits, is manifestly replying to a certain Foucault, and especially Foucault's protégés among the then newly prominent Nouveau Philosophe. The thesis that the political apparatus of the bourgeois state should be the object, not the terrain, of working-class struggle is advanced against Nikos Palantzas and a still closer comrade in theoretical arms, Balibar. The latter had by 1977 begun defending a version of the Palantzian position that he had only recently been storming, the idea that the capitalist state can be democratized from within, even as he puts it in a later summary of his nascent disagreement with Althusser, that the very, quote, existence of a social movement, quote, outside the state, end quote, is a contradiction in terms, end quote. So that the, quote, development of democracy beyond its class frontiers, end quote, does not imply, quote, the dismantling of the state apparatus, end quote. The closing critique of Gramsci calls for a longer gloss, since it names only one of its targets. The rest are the Italian communist thinkers who had, since the mid-1960s, been engaged in an attempt to present the Gramscian notion of hegemony as an alternative to class dictatorship, and their French disciples, notably Christine Bucky-Glucksmann, who criticized Althusser in the light of the Italian reinterpretation of Gramsci. The more obscure and more central polemic in the essay, Marx and His Limits, assumes a familiarity with odd debates on matters such as the revolutionary potential of the French anti-riot police and the now forgotten arguments that made their way from Les Communistes et l'État into the discussion documents of the Communist Party of France, May 1979 23rd Congress. Since Althusser did not consider such material too humble for extended, if scornful, notice in the article Marx and His Limits, we should review it briefly here. Section 5. The tendency that Althusser had fought in the PCF since the 1960s was common to most West European communist parties. By the mid-1970s, it had acquired a new name, Eurocommunism. Eurocommunism's distinguishing feature was the one Althusser had labeled ideological socialism, quote, ideological socialism. Rejection of the idea that a state was necessarily the linchpin of the dictatorship of a particular class in favor of the claim that it was possible to change the class character of certain states. In particular, the proletariat and its allies could use certain parliamentary democratic states, notably those in which the biggest Euro-communist parties, the Communist Party of Italy and the Communist Party of France, hoped to form governments as tools for establishing truly democratic rule. It could then use those democratized states to replace capitalism with socialism. The Euro-communist argument rebutted throughout most of Althusser's Marx and His Limits was thus not that the existing French state was not a class state. Quite the contrary, according to a theory on which the PCF had put its imprimatur in the mid-1960s, it was dominated by the boards of some 30 monopolistic firms that exploited most of the rest of the population in league with international capital. But because these, quote, state monopoly capitalists, unquote, were numerically insignificant, they could be isolated by a, quote, union of the French people, unquote, who shared an interest in chasing them from their state fiefdoms. This would be accomplished after a left victory at the polls by, quote, pushing democracy to its limits, unquote, or transforming it into a, quote, advanced democracy, unquote, or a, quote, new democracy, unquote. The formulas varied. There was no need to establish a violent class dictatorship to do so, or a power unrestrained by law. Such forms had been mandated by specific historical conditions, notably those of the Russian Revolution, where only a minority had been for socialism, and the Bolsheviks had confronted an armed dictatorship. Conditions in France were infinitely more auspicious. Thanks to a century and more of working-class struggle, representative democracy had imposed decisive legal constraints on state power. The monopolies respected them even under bourgeois democracy. Why should they respect them less under advanced democracy, where a large majority would see to their enforcement? Under such conditions, an absolute majority could be rallied to socialism before its construction began. There would then be no need to destroy the state of an already socialist populace. It could rather be continually democratized and, quote, revolutionized, and, quote, from within, and thus transformed into an agent of the new order. Had Gramsci not shown that, quote, the conquest of state power is far rather the consequence than the cause of a class's dominant role, end quote. Gramsci. Or maybe that's not Gramsci, I'm not sure. It might be a paraphrase. The essay, Marx and His Limits, takes particular issue with two corollaries of the idea of, quote, democratizing, and, quote, the state. That the actually existing democratic state serves special interests because it had been commandeered by monopoly capital, suggested that, by nature, democracy had a universal vocation. The suggestion had its communist locus classicus for Althusser in a, quote, openly rightist bourgeois essay by François Hincker, later dissolved into Les Communistes et l'État, and distilled back out in the article Marx and His Limits, where it does human service anonymously as the archetypal bad example. The French state, Francois Hincart said, albeit, quote, bourgeois, was also, quote, social. The French state exercised, quote, genuinely democratic functions, end quote, and as such had authentic, quote, universal content, end quote. Quote, smashing, end quote, it was in fact a matter of liberating its universal social functions from their bourgeois prison. Witness the fact that it rendered services which, quote, taken separately, end quote, possessed, quote, universal use value, end quote. It, quote, built schools, roads, and hospitals, end quote, and ran courts which, while they had tended to favor the dominant, also, quote, ensured, like it or not, a certain security, order, and calm, end quote. Hincart. Maybe it's Hincare. Moreover, if the state exercised a, quote, political class constraint, end quote, it did so, quote, first of all, by law, end quote, which by no means necessarily implied the use of violence. As for the officials who applied this essentially nonviolent constraint, civil servants, magistrates, court officers, police, they were increasingly troubled by the glaring, quote, unbearable, end quote, class character, end quote, of their state, which thus harbored potential enemies in the, quote, very heart of its apparatus, end quote. The last theme was a Euro-communist shibboleth. The righteously indignant, even rebellious state agent, the riot policeman included, was a stock figure in the folklore of Eurocommunism, the short form of its argument against the orthodox Marxist thesis of the indivisibility of the class state. The space, titled The Space, the essay Marx and His Limits devotes to minimizing it, is an index of its popularity. For certain Italian Euro-communist theorists, quote, democratizing the state meant saving the state from itself, pitting on Gramsci's warrant the idea of a gradual conquest of power against the thesis that a revolutionary class had to destroy the existing state. They argued that the party had, in its quest for hegemony, to work, quote, profound strategic transformations, end quote, in its relation to it. In Biagio de Giovanni's version of the argument, to which the article Marx and His Limits pays conspicuous if anonymous attention, the task of the, quote, proletariat's party of government, end quote, was no longer, quote, to detach major sections of the ruling class from the state, end quote, let alone to smash it. It was to, quote, build democracy on state terrain, end quote, recomposing the society and state which the dominant class's, quote, political forms, end quote, tended to, quote, disaggregate, end quote. It was within the new, recomposed state that a, quote, transformation of the relations between classes, end quote, would commence. The passive support the PCI had already lent a Christian democratic government was presumably proof that it already had. New section, section 6. The reader will find Althusser's response to these arguments in the article Marx and His Limits. Rather than summarize it, let us outline the principles that found it. They are the founding principles of aleatory materialism as well, for it is by virtue of Marx's discovery of the necessity of class dictatorship, his main contribution to knowledge, he wrote in 1852, that he belongs, according to Althusser, to the, quote, undercurrent current, end quote. Since Althusser's anti-teleological reconceptualization of it as the discovery of, quote, the necessity of contingency, end quote.
It's 9 a.m.
Oh. Excuse me, sorry about that. Since Althusser's anti-teleological reconceptualization of it as the discovery of, quote, the necessity of contingency, end quote, grounds his own aleatory materialism. A glance at his 30 years' reflection on class dictatorship will provide us with the elements of an aleatory materialist primer. The article, The Underground Current, closes with a discussion of the two Marxian conceptions of the mode of production. The first, aleatory materialist, has it that a mode of production originates in a, quote, aleatory encounter of independent elements, end quote. It, quote, eliminates in the theory of primitive accumulation. It, quote, culminates in the theory of primitive accumulation, end quote. Let's look up what the word aleatory means, actually. Aleatory means depending on the throw of a dice or on chance, random. Aleatory, relating to or denoting music or other forms of art involving elements of random choice, sometimes using statistical or computer techniques during their composition, production, or performance. Quote, aleatory music, unquote. Okay, so the first, aleatory materialist, has it that a mode of production originates in a, quote, aleatory, like random, encounter of independent elements, unquote. It, quote, culminates in the theory of primitive accumulation, unquote. The second, rooted in, quote, the necessity, of the accomplished fact, unquote, is, quote, totalitarian, teleological, and philosophical, unquote. This discussion breaks off after a few pages. It is pursued in Althusser's first book, the 1959 Montesquieu, Politics and History. The book, Politics and History, claims that Montesquieu anticipated the materialist Marx. One reason is that he rejected, quote, the problem of origins is absurd, end quote, and thought, quote, history without attributing to it an end, end quote. He was, quote, probably the first person to do so before Marx, end quote. What was gained thereby is demonstrated in the book's conclusion, which applies Montesquieu's anti-teleological principles to Montesquieu. The Marquis de la Brede did not work his, quote, theoretical revolution, end quote, says this lesson in aleatory materialist historiography, avant la lettre, because he was a prophet of the revolutionary bourgeoisie. Contrary to the usual claim, precisely the bourgeoisie's, he was a man, quote, who looked towards the past, end quote. Indeed, there was no revolutionary bourgeoisie to which he could have looked. Althusser makes the last point in a passage about evading the, quote, appearance of retrospective history, end quote, that unmistakably anticipates a famous warning in the book For Marx about writing history in the future anterior. Just as unmistakably, it rehearses the conclusion to the Underground Current article. The most, quote, delicate point, quote, in the Montesquieu book, Politics and History, says its author in a 1959 letter bears on a, quote, single encounter, end quote, of two ideas about the late feudal French bourgeoisie, that the, quote, primary conflict, end quote, of the day pitted it against the nobles, and that in this conflict the king, quote, sided with, end quote, it, or, quote, should have or could have, end quote. We shall return to the king. Let us first consider the, quote, difficult problem of the nature, of the bourgeoisie, end quote. It had to do with what Althusser calls in 1983 the historiography of the, quote, accomplished fact, end quote, exemplified by the anachronistic tendency to think the early bourgeoisie is, quote, an element predestined to unify all other elements of the mode of production, end quote. Quote, the biggest danger, end quote, he goes on in 1959, quote, is to project onto the, quote, bourgeoisie of this period the image of the later bourgeoisie, end quote. One has to, quote, lend the bourgeoisie of absolute monarchy the traits of the later bourgeoisie in order to think it in this early period as a class radically antagonistic to the feudal class, unquote. In reality, quote, nothing is more doubtful, unquote, than that the, quote, mercantile economy, unquote, on which its, quote, most advanced elements, unquote, were, quote, essentially dependent, unquote, quote, was foreign to feudal society in principle, unquote. Not only was the mercantile bourgeoisie not alien to the feudal order, it was an integral part of the feudal order. Quote, the whole cycle of its economic activity, remained inscribed in the limits of and structures of the feudal state. Inscribed in the limits and structures of the feudal state, unquote. The 1959 letter goes so far as to suggest that one cannot here, quote, speak of a bourgeois class, unquote, at all, at least as, quote, fundamentally antagonistic to the feudal class, unquote. Quote, the mercantile economy on which its power and pretensions are based is not radically at odds with the economic category of feudal production in the period, unquote. Who sowed the illusion that it was? Montesquieu names accomplices. The Underground Current article unmasks their ringleader. It is the author of the discussion of the mercantile economy in Capital, where, quote, we encounter the great question of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Here Marx forgets that he was the second person after Montesquieu to undertake to think history without attributing to it an end. He reverts the ideology of the 1859 preface, and thus the notion, quote, of a mythical, quote, decay, end quote, of the feudal mode of production and the birth of the bourgeoisie out of the midst of this decay, end quote. Quote, what proves, end quote, Althusser asks in 1983 as he does in 1959, that the feudal bourgeoisie, quote, was not a class of the feudal mode of production, a sign of the reinforcement rather than the decay of this mode. Question mark. What if the bourgeoisie, far from being the contrary product of the feudal class, was its crowning perfection, end quote. The history lesson is also a lesson in politics. Feudal society, Montesquieu knows, obeys a, quote, necessity whose empire is so strict that it embraces not only bizarre institutions which last, but even the accident, contained in a momentary encounter, end quote. He may even know why. The feudal constellation of institutions which last is crowned by one which ensures that it will continue to last. Its, quote, limits and structures, end quote, intact to the very moment of its dissolution. This guarantor of the necessity of feudal society's least contingencies is its, quote, state apparatus, end quote, embodied in the king. Yet the king is not the state. The lonely hour of his majesty never comes. The, quote, king is never alone, end quote. The absolutist state, Montesquieu understands, is one in which, quote, eminences and ranks, end quote, prevail. The absolute monarch who forgets it comes up against the, quote, rock of the aristocrat's idea of their aristocracy, their, quote, honor, on which the monarchy runs the way a motor, quote, runs on petrol, end quote. Honor, for Althusser's Montesquieu, is an idea corresponding to a force, quote, above any laws, not just religious and moral, but also political, end quote. Law is another translation of this force. The law of the realm preserves a force above the law from the encroachment by the king, the people, or an alliance of the two. It preserves the king into the bargain, planting, quote, the rampart of the nobility, end quote, between him and the people. The people, the, quote, fourth puissance, end quote, banished to the other side of the twin ramparts of honor and law, is absent from the hierarchical alliance of their exploiters, and only elusively present in Montesquieu himself. Its absence is all but absolute. The fourth puissance, quote, haunts the alliance of the other three as a memory does its loss, by its censorship, end quote. One sees then, once the mirage of retrospective history is dispelled, why the encounter of the two received ideas about the late feudal period is dangerous. The idea that the conflict at its heart pitted bourgeoisie against nobility, and that in this conflict the king, quote, sided with, end quote, the former, breeds the illusion that the king played one off against the other in order to, quote, raise himself above, end quote, these, quote, two antagonistic classes, end quote, or, quote, should have or could have, end quote. That is, it encourages a, quote, notion of ... the state, end quote, according to which, quote, a political power can be established outside classes and over them, end quote. Marx, too, once entertained this illusion, writing in the German Ideology that in 18th century France, where, quote, aristocracy and bourgeoisie were contending for domination, and, quote, domination was shared, end quote. But that, in Althusser's view, is the tribute he advanced to the un-Marxist myth of the state. Class domination, he saw soon thereafter, cannot be shared. The reason lies in the very nature of domination. Grounded in exploitation, the, quote, force above the law, end quote, on which the state runs, says Montesquieu, the book, is a surplus of force. This surplus measures the difference between the respective forces of, quote, power and poverty, end quote, between the violence of the exploiting classes on the one hand and that of the, quote, masses of the exploited, end quote, on the other, transforming it into laws that, quote, maintain and perpetuate, end quote, the domination of the exploiters. The state apparatus necessarily excludes the exploited, the, quote, force of the exploited from the force crystallized in the state. They are similarly excluded, or better, quote, made absent, end quote, by the force crystallized in the dominant ideology. For the ideology that provides the state's, quote, petrol is also a realization of the excess violence that measures the ruling class's advantage in the struggle of the classes. This description, Althusser insists, applies to the feudal state as such, not as might be imagined to its more primitive forms alone. Absolute monarchy, according to Montesquieu, is the, quote, indispensable political apparatus, end quote, that the changing historical situation imposes on the underlying, quote, regime, end quote, a, quote, new political form required to maintain, end quote, the old, quote, regime of exploitation, end quote. The regime itself would not change until the apparatus of domination that crowned it did, until, quote, certain génie révolutionnaire, end quote, smashed, quote, the limits and structures of the feudal state, end quote, shortening its rural representative by a head. Hence the delicacy of the, quote, most delicate point, end quote, in Althusser's book, Montesquieu book, Politics and History. It has to do with the, quote, bourgeois contamination, end quote. Althusser says in his 1959 letter, quote, of the Marxist idea of class relations, end quote. Responsible for this contamination were the 18th century's, quote, reformists, end quote, the first to trade in the notion that, quote, absolute monarchy was set up against the nobility, and that the king relied on the commoners, to balance the power of his feudal opponents, end quote. What these early representatives of the long-standing tendency failed to see, along with a certain Marx, was that feudal society was, from first to last, a dictatorship of the aristocracy. What made their error delicate was the systematic transposition of it by their 20th century communist heirs. The article, Marx and His Limits, uses a term that Althusser introduced in a 1975 discussion of class struggle at the level of theory, quote, conflictual difference, end quote, to name the concept that Montesquieu introduces without the name, to think class struggle at the level of ideology in the state, is a soul of Althusser's vision of class dictatorship or domination. The second word, the manifesto says, Marx and his limits, is, quote, 1,000 times better, end quote, than the first, which Marx chose out of a, quote, taste for extremes, end quote. It sums up in a phrase his quarrel with Euro-communist visions of democratizing the state, because the state results from the transformation of an excess of class force, the differential between the class struggle of the dominant class and all the others, friend or foe. It is by definition the preserve of the victors in the struggle, and it is such whatever the, quote, political form, end quote, through which the dominant exercise state domination. The domination of the landed nobility persists under absolutism. That of the capitalist class is not necessarily diminished. The contrary generally holds. With the advent of parliamentary democracy, by the same token, dictatorship in the usual political sense and bourgeois democracy are both forms of capitalist, quote, dictatorship. In Marx's reversing class domination is not a matter of changing such forms, but depends on securing a surplus of political, economic, and ideological force over a class adversary. Without the excess of force, there can be no question of springing, quote, structures and limits, end quote. An aleatory materialist axiom affirms, quote, the primacy of the structure over its elements, end quote. Quote, once the encounter has been effected, end quote. The Montesquieu book illustrates it. It asserts against the teleological Marx or his stand-ins that the feudal bourgeoisie is thoroughly feudal. Not an embryo of bourgeois society gestating in a late feudal womb, because it is a subordinate element of a structure constituted by a feudal class dictatorship. Whether or not the later idea was, in 1959, an element of a structure of thought that could be called aleatory materialist is a question we shall here suspend. Section 7. If an encounter is to give rise to, quote, a world, end quote, the underground current article affirms, quote, that encounter must last. It must be not a, quote, brief encounter, end quote, but a lasting encounter, which then becomes the basis for all reality, all necessity, all meaning, and all reason. But the encounter can also not last. Then there is no world, end quote, Althusser. Politics and History, the Montesquieu book, considers, from the standpoint of its result, the lasting encounter, such as the ones that gave rise to the worlds of feudalism or capitalism. But Althusser's overriding concern is the brief encounter, concretely, the one that engendered Soviet society, shakily based on a, quote, socialist mode of production, end quote. Quote, socialism too can perish, end quote. Althusser began warning in the mid-1960s, spelling out the thinly veiled thesis of his first books. The most important of the genealogies of aleatory materialism begins with it. The brief encounter is symptomatic. Hegel, the idealist Montesquieu's heir, cannot properly account for worlds which last for reasons suggested by the fact that, as Althusser flatly affirms in the 1962 article Contradiction and Overdetermination, which I believe is in 4 Marx, the, quote, logic of supersession, end quote, cannot account for Stalin or his successors, USSR. The materialist dialectic, the Althusserian Marxist logic of, quote, overdetermination, can, because, like the materialist Montesquieu's dialectic, it conceives the social whole as a combination of relatively autonomous levels, one of which is determinate, quote, in the last instance, end quote. Hence it need no longer dismiss Soviet, quote, terror, repression, and dogmatism, end quote, as contingent, quote, survivals, end quote, superseded by a higher necessity, or on Engels' variant, as negligible accidents, quote, between which, end quote, an imperious necessity, quote, picks its sovereign way, end quote. Althusser. Overdetermination can account for the, quote, necessity of these accidents, end quote, themselves, explaining how the, quote, terribly positive and active structured reality, end quote, bred by the, quote, circumstances of a peculiar, quote, national and international conjuncture, end quote, managed to, quote, cling tenaciously to life, after the revolution and from then till now, end quote. Althusser. For, quote, tenaciously, let us read, quote, tenuously, since they are synonyms in the context. Why was this constellation of terribly bizarre institutions, which had clung to life for decades in imminent danger of perishing? The answer Althusser proposed in 1962, elaborated in Sur la reproduction, and never abandoned, was that the socialist state was running on capitalist ideological, quote, petrol. It was an answer dictated by Montesquieu. He apparently knew, albeit, quote, blindly, Althusser said in his 1976 Barcelona lecture on class dictatorship, even more than that the feudal state was, quote, class violence transformed into law, end quote. He knew it was violence transformed into ideology as well. One cannot comprehend the state on Althusser's 1959 summary of Montesquieu's argument if one considers only its, quote, nature, in other words, its constitutional form, that which answers the question, who holds power and how is it exercised? One must also consider its, quote, principle, the question of the, quote, condition, on which it can exercise power, quote, by law. That leads from formal considerations, quote, into life, end quote. For men to be, quote, lasting subject, end quote, to a government, they must have a, quote, disposition to it. Sur la reproduction speaks of a, quote, attitude. Such a disposition can be brought about only by a principle capable of maintaining, quote, the intersection of the nature of the government, its political form, with the real life of men, end quote. Sur la reproduction says, quote, an imaginary relationship to men's real conditions of existence, end quote. The state runs on this principle, and on it alone, quote, the way some motors will run only on petrol, end quote. As, quote, Marx in his limits, as the article, Marx in his limits, repeats after Althusser's Montesquieu book, and as Marx does not, for he ignores the issue, that is his main limit. In a word, Montesquieu's feudal dictatorship is a, quote, nature principle totality, end quote. His version, or Althusser's, of Gramsci's, quote, expanded state. Sur la reproduction adds that a state's ideological petrol fuels, quote, ideological state apparatuses, end quote, ISAs, which, quote, realize the, quote, state's ideology, end quote. That such apparatuses and the fuel those apparatuses run on are, quote, not materially grounded in the existence of the state, end quote, but in, quote, economic class exploitation, end quote, which crucially also breeds class ideologies outside the states, and that under capitalism, the ideological state apparatuses transform such economic, quote, conflictual difference, end quote. The concept is present, the term is not, into means of dominating these other ideologies, exterior to bourgeois ideology. They do so for a reason that explains the existence of the rest of the state as well, in a class society. The inherently conflictual relation between exploiters and exploited, which presides over the, quote, combination of elements known as an economic mode of production, cannot maintain itself by economic means of domination alone. Quote, indispensable to the survival of this combination, end quote, says Althusser in the book Reading Capital. is, quote, a certain political configuration, end quote, imposed and maintained, end quote, by means of material force, that of the state, and of moral power, that of ideologies, end quote. Economic class struggle accordingly obeys the logic of the supplement, the relations of production/exploitation that determine, in the last instance, the complex unity of the state depend on, for their survival, on the state that derives from them, that is, on the supplementary political and ideological relations of domination, which ensure their reproduction. Both Sur la Reproduction and the Marx and His Limits article called this the, quote, paradox of the capitalist state. To end exploitation, it is first necessary to dismantle the state which, engendered by it, presides over it, the linchpin of the dictatorship that sustains the capitalist economic regime. What enables an encounter of exploiters and exploited to last, then, is an economic, political, and ideological structure of domination that enables it to reproduce itself as a mode of production, a viable class dictatorship. Only after it has become capable of reproducing itself can it be said to exist. The same holds for its elements. As Montesquieu points out, the feudal bourgeoisie is not an element of capitalism that pre-exists capitalism. It comes into being as the capitalist bourgeoisie, only with the production, that is, the reproduction, of the capitalist mode of production, which depends on the perpetuation of its victory in the class struggle. Class dictatorship is why history is not teleology. The fact that the ideological state apparatuses proceed from the, quote, conflictual difference, end quote, of economic class struggle is, from this point of view, essential. It does not preclude the possibility of a sometimes critically important struggle on their terrain. It does imply, however, that they remain, by definition, the terrain of the dominant, and thus that a struggle for, quote, hegemony cannot be won until the class domination maintained by the state and all its apparatuses is reversed. That it is impossible to put a social formation, quote, in parentheses in order to create the future in its midst, end quote. This is the kernel of the critique of Gramsci in the Marx and His Limits article. But it by no means follows from it that, once domination is reversed, the battle to establish a new class dictatorship has been won. As a rule, it has just begun, because the ideologies and ideological apparatuses of the old order resist, such as the lesson of the exemplary Althusserian example of the brief encounter. It affirms more concretely that the failure of Soviet socialism represented the revenge of the pre-revolutionary ideological state apparatuses on the revolution, that the conjunctural, quote, circumstances surrounding the Russian Revolution did not just, quote, survive, but were, quote, reactivated by a new structure that, quote, ensured their survival, end quote. Thus means that the pre-revolutionary ideological state apparatuses were incorporated into the Soviet state by a Communist Party of the Soviet Union, become a party of the state, when its chief task would have been to lead, as the party of working class dictatorship, the long class struggle, quote, without which revolution is unthinkable, end quote, to smash the bourgeois ideological state apparatuses in a confrontation with the Soviet state itself. It follows that the failure of the Bolshevik Revolution caused an effect of the poverty of an idealist philosophy, which reduced the historical dialectic to a progressive sequence of modes of production generated by the expansion of the productive forces, stemmed from the attempt to build socialism after stifling, quote, in the silences of the terror, end quote, the embryonic working class dictatorship, the, quote, bastard or monstrous forms, end quote, that resulted, attributable to, in part to, quote, chance, were still called, quote, socialism, declares Marx and His Limits, the Marx and His Limits essay, only because that had, quote, become routine, or in order to deceive the popular masses, end quote. Althusser had, in fact, long since come to the broader conclusion that socialism as such was a bastard form, not of mode of production in its own right. That thesis led on, in conjunction with his 1966 to 72 elaboration of the theory of the encounter first proposed in the Contradiction and Overdetermination article, to the materialism of the encounter. Sorry, 1 second. Lost my spot. New section, section 8. Quote, Marx's fundamental discovery, the topography, end quote, envisages a, quote, structure of domination, end quote, a society structured by a class dictatorship, as a, quote, structure in dominance, end quote, an overdetermined combination of irreducibly distinct levels dominated by one of them and determined in the last instance by the economy. Conceived against Hegelian Marxist theorizations of the social whole as an expressive totality, each part of which reflects the contradiction in forming the whole, the topography is necessarily also conceived against the corresponding teleologies of history. Unsurprisingly, Althusser's alternative turns on explaining the constellation of the topography's distinct autonomous levels as the effect of the contingent combination of their distinct, separately evolving histories. Is a short step to the conversion of the topography into an instrument for explaining, in non-teleological fashion, the eruption of anything new. Thus, Althusser can declare in a 1966 letter on the emergence of the unconscious that defining a, quote, logic different from that of Genesis, end quote, according to which a thing has to, quote, exist in some manner before its own birth, in order to be born, end quote, amounts to the same thing as defining the specific forms of a materialist dialectic, end quote, precisely what the topography was invented to do. The encounter was always, for Althusser, one of the specific forms of the materialist dialectic required by a topographical theory of the social structure. Moreover, he concluded, almost as soon as he had introduced his conception of the materialist dialectic in the 1962 Contradiction and Overdetermination article, that the theory of the encounter implied by the topography lent itself to explaining the emergence of things other than social formations, beginning with the theory of the encounter itself. In a 1963 letter, Althusser wryly makes his addressee declare, quote, contingency, chance, or what Machiavelli calls fortuna, end quote, is, quote, the pre-Marxian concept that comes closest to what Lenin calls the encounter of the objective and subjective conditions of any practice whatsoever. ... Knowledge, too, is only ever produced by a, quote, exceptional, end quote, encounter. In other words, it is produced by a historical conjuncture in which several distinct practices intervene. I can sense, Louis, that you are going to develop ... this point. I can already sense in your essay, Contradiction and Overdetermination, the imminence and, as it were, ineluctable necessity of this discovery, end quote. One second. Who says that? I don't know who said that. I don't know who that quote's from. Like the article, Marx and His Limits, Reading Capital, the book, pursues the program sketched here, illustrating the theory of the, quote, exceptional encounter. The quote, exceptional, end quote, encounter, end quote, with respect to both the origins of capitalism and historical materialism. Quote, Marx's text on primitive accumulation, quote, Althusser declares at the end of Althusser's contribution to the book, quote, constitute the material if not already the outline of ... the theory of the transition, bracket, from feudalism to capitalism, end bracket, end quote. This earnest of things to come serves as the bridge between his own illustration of, quote, the necessity of contingency, end quote, which bears on the, quote, combination that produced Marx's theory, and Balibar's about the, quote, encounter that produced capitalism. A year later, Althusser drew up a balance sheet of these and related attempts to spell out for Marx the implications of Marx's fundamental discovery. They constitute, he said, a, quote, theory of the encounter, end quote, in unpublished notes that assimilate the concept of the, quote, conjuncture, quote, conjunction, end quote, to the Spinoza's, quote, singular essence, end quote, and refer in passing to, quote, Epicurus, the Klineman, Cournot, end quote, and the, quote, theory of the swerve, end quote. A geneticist might be forgiven for concluding that in the theory of the encounter, the materialism of the encounter existed, at least, quote, in some manner, end quote, before its own birth. Nowhere are the affinities between the anti-finalism of earlier and later Althusserianism more striking than in the chapter on primitive accumulation in Reading Capital, a book. In the transitional period between feudalism and capitalism, by Balibar's account of Marx's account of it, the, quote, unity of a conjuncture, end quote, throws up elements whose, quote, encounter, end quote, in the event of a happy, quote, find, end quote, coalesces in a structure that is both distinct from the one to which they previously belonged and, quote, once, bracket, the new structure, end bracket, has been constituted, end quote, determinate of them. It is thus, quote, necessary, with respect to these elements, once they come under its, quote, jurisdiction. Its necessity is not, however, dictated by the old structure, which really, quote, dies out as such, end quote, when the new one is formed. Nor is it inscribed in the elements of the new structure, quote, combines, end quote, which, quote, have different and independent origins, end quote. They, quote, become its effects, end quote, only after their encounter imposes its necessity on their contingency. This contingency, finally, quote, does not imply chance, end quote, a statement that seems to mean that the elements combined in the new structure are not accidentally combinable. A world comes about, in the Underground Current article, when atoms falling parallel to one another in the void collide and pile up in consequence of an infinitesimal swerve called the Klineman. Quote, swerve engenders, quote, the form of order, and the form of beings, whose birth is induced by this pileup, determined as they are by the structure of the encounter, whence, once the encounter has been effected, but not before, the primacy of the structure over its elements, whence, what one must call an affinity and a complementarity of the elements that come into play in the encounter, their, quote, readiness to collide, interlock, end quote, end quote. Quote, no determination of these elements can be assigned, end quote, Althusser adds, quote, except by working backwards from the results to its becoming, end quote, Althusser. The geneticist error consists in assuming that this result came about before it did, or that it had to. Perpetrators of the error retrospectively obliterate the difference between the, quote, several distinct ... elements engendered in the previous historical process by different genealogies that are independent of each other and can, moreover, be traced back to several possible, quote, origins, end quote, end quote. Althusser says in 1967. Only when atoms, quote, destined to encounter each other, end quote, combine or, quote, take hold, end quote, affirms the Underground Current article, do they, quote, enter the realm of being that they inaugurate and constitute beings. In short, there emerges in them a structure of being, or of the world, that assigns each of its elements its place, meaning, and role, or better, establishes them as, quote, elements of, end quote, end quote. Althusser. Whence this 1966 warning about the perils of the retrospective illusion? A summary of Althusser's 1960-65 account of the emergence of Marxism as the, quote, surprise, end quote, of its prehistory, not its, quote, goal, end quote. Quote, in 1845, there appears something radically new, under the explosive impact of the combination of its diverse elements, The old ideological problematic was shattered, and a new scientific problematic erupted from its disintegration, That certain concepts of the old ideological problematic took their place in the new one in no way affects our thesis, for we know that a concept is theoretical only as a function of the theoretical system in which it is inscribed, and which assigned it its place, function, and meaning, end quote. Althusser. Does this warning about the transformative power of the combination apply to Althusser's early concept of the transformative power of the combination? Or does Althusser's, quote, late concept of the encounter preserve the elements of its predecessor intact? The book Reading Capital, echoing the book For Marx, affirms that Marx's topography differs from idealist conceptions of the whole, and that it is a Verbindung, or, quote, structure without combines, end quote, autonomous levels constituting Verbindungen in their term. Quote, the elements defined by Marx, end quote, Althusser writes in 1966, quote, are, quote, combined, end quote. I prefer to translate the term Verbindung, are, quote, conjoined, in, quote, taking hold in a new structure. This structure can only be thought in its eruption as the effect of a conjunction, end quote, Althusser. Quote, conjuncture means conjunction, end quote. Explains his last book, quote, that is an aleatory encounter of elements, end quote, Althusser. If the contingent or aleatory encounter is the defining concept of aleatory materialism, then it would seem to follow the Althusserianism had taken hold as the, quote, surprise of its prehistory by 1962. As for the metaphor of the, quote, take, end quote, parenthesis, prize or surprise. I'm not sure if that's I'm not sure if that's just in italics or if that's a word in French. Introduced in 1965 by way of that pun, it might be said to have, quote, taken hold, end quote, in Althusser's 1966 article, 3 Notes on the Theory of Discourses, for it were not that this text assimilates it to the topography proposed in For Marx, the book. The unconscious, quote, 3 Notes argues, the 3 Notes article argues, is realized in articulation with ideology, when it comes together with ideological structures with which it has, quote, affinities. It abruptly, quote, takes hold, end quote, the way mayonnaise does, parenthesis, in French, in parenthesis. This prize, or prize, is said to, quote, call for a type of reflection, in every respect similar to the one by means of which Marx situates the different instances and thinks their articulation, end quote. It is also similar to the one by means of which Althusser thinks their disarticulation. For Marx, the book, where the mayonnaise is present in its absence, evokes the, quote, fusion into, quote, a ruptural unity, end quote, of the, quote, circumstances and, quote, currents that crystallize in social revolutions. Ruptural unity, or, quote, take, from the egg's point of view, it is much the same thing. Section 9. But not every ruptural unity takes. There are, as it were, mistakes, such as the revolution that failed to produce viable class dictatorships. Revolutions that failed to produce viable class dictatorships. And not every encounter fuses in the ruptural unity, thanks to which it can take place. Most encounters are virtual or utopian, that is, non-encounters. Althusser's long reflection on the first idea, the exemplary example of the, quote, swerve, which takes or not, in the, quote, late terminology of 1966, was assigned a new place, meaning and rule by the late theoretical system centered on the second, imagined as the reign of atoms, falling side by side in the void, except when the Kleineman induces a, quote, pileup, end quote. The transformation was catalyzed by an encounter with his own early thought as echoed in Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's, or Guattari, I forget how to say his name, Epicurean variation on Balibar's variation of the Althusserian theme of the necessity of contingency. Quote, the encounter, end quote, that engendered capitalism, Deleuze and Guattari wrote in their 1972 Anti-Oedipus, generously quoting Balibar's study of primitive accumulation in Marx, quote, might not have taken place with the free workers and money capital existing, quote, virtually side by side, end quote. Deleuze and Guattari. The proof is that, quote, great accidents were necessary and amazing encounters that could have happened elsewhere or before or might never have happened, to, fashion a new machine bearing the determinations of the capitalist socius, end quote. I'm not sure who that quote's from. This Deleuzian conclusion was scarcely the surprise of its Althusserian prehistory. The surprising thing is that Althusser did not state it first. Hardly was it stated for Althusser, then he formulated its premises in Livre sur le communisme and Livre sur l'impérialisme. We shall sketch the most important in closing. Readers of the Underground Current article will decide whether or to what extent these premises underpin the materialism of the encounter. They are bound up with the question of the USSR, quote, ensuring the survival, end quote, of the pre-revolutionary ideological state apparatuses. Stalin's party and state had, on Althusser's analysis, ensured the demise of Soviet working class dictatorship. Yet he maintained, through Sur la Reproduction and beyond, that Soviet society was based on a, quote, socialist mode of production, end quote. The problematic implication was that a mode of production could be reproduced by a state apparatus inimical to it. By 1973, the problem has disappeared. Quote, there is no such thing, end quote. Livre sur l'impérialisme contends, quote, as a socialist mode of production, end quote. Socialism is a contest between coexisting elements of the capitalist and communist modes of production. The argument is elaborated by way of another about the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The heart of it is the Deleuzian Althusserian claim that capitalism might not have happened. The stake of it is the idea that communism might never happen. We treat the victory of capitalism as inevitable, according to Livre sur l'impérialisme, because, confronted with capitalism's results, we approach those results as the historian does, quote, we always reason on the basis of the accomplished fact, end quote. Yet history itself gives the lie to this, quote, fetishism of the fait accompli, end quote. Regarded with an eye to its uncertain unfolding, it shows, rather, that the mode of production, quote, can fail to exist, come into existence but perish as soon as it appears, or, on the contrary, grow stronger and pursue its historical destiny, end quote. Thus, quote, the capitalist mode of production died several times before, quote, taking hold, end quote, on the feudal or other modes of production, end quote. Althusser, as in the 13th century Po Valley. when a first methodological principle, the object of materialist history should be not the accomplished fact, but the accomplished fact's accomplishment. The accomplished fact's accomplishment. Quote, how, as livre sur l'impérialisme, quote, did the accomplished fact become the accomplished fact, end quote. Althusser. Everything that is accomplished fact. Quote, die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist. ... Everything that comes about, everything that is the case, everything that falls, end quote. More exactly, the world is everything that succeeds in reproducing itself, since, quote, existence is self-reproduction, end quote, and everything that happens is part of the history of the world, yet not everything that happens is, quote, historic, and, quote, paradoxically, history itself, end quote, judges what is. Its judgments take the form of the, quote, results of the class struggle, end quote, that is the, quote, victory of the dominant class, end quote. Historic are events which give rise to such victories. Better, such events give rise to what counts as historic, for there is no measure for them outside themselves. Quote, the measure of the event is measureless, end quote, says Livre sur le communisme after Lenin. This means in particular that they give rise to their own elements, beginning with the victorious and defeated class. Whence a second key principle, simultaneously political and theoretical. The class struggle, Livre sur l'impérialisme, repeats after the 1972-73 article Reply to John Lewis, has primacy over the contending classes. It is because exploitation, quote, is the case, end quote, that there is a dominant class whose class struggle commences with and essentially consists in the fact that it exploits. Similarly, exploitation engenders the exploited classes, whose usually defensive class struggles originate in their resistance to it. The Underground Current article talks more cryptically about the, quote, priority of the occurrence, of the fall, over all its forms, end quote. Althusser. And, quote, the primacy of the encounter over the forms which the encounter gives birth, end quote. The contingent encounter which combines, quote, atoms in a, quote, world, it adds, quote, confer their reality upon the atoms themselves, end quote. Before the encounter, there is only, quote, the non-world that is merely bracket there and bracket unreal existence, end quote. Althusser. How then did the accomplished fact of capitalism become an accomplished fact? Quote, in a certain sense, end quote, Althusser affirms in 1973, quote, the encounter of the owners of money, ... and free laborers, ... is sufficient response to the question, end quote. Althusser. In another, as we have seen, it is not, for a reason stated in Sur la reproduction, quote, the, quote, duration, end quote, of a given social formation dominated by a given mode of production, ... depends, ... on the, quote, duration, end quote, of the class state, end quote. Both ideas beg translation into the language of the aleatory materialist encounter, which lasts or fails to, if they are not the original of which aleatory materialism is the translation. What Althusser learned from Anti-Oedipus bore, however, less on the accomplishment of accomplished facts than on the non-accomplishment of what has failed to come about. Quote, the existence of a thing is a result, end quote. Livre sur le communisme proclaims, quote, and this result is not performed in the state of affairs preceding the existence of the thing, end quote. Althusser. So ran the alternative proposed by the, quote, theory of the encounter, end quote, to the geneticist logic which has it that a thing has somehow to exist, quote, before its own birth, in order to be born, end quote. But the anti-geneticism of the theory of the encounter, if it did not quite reason on the basis of accomplished facts, nevertheless sets out from the fact of their existence, as Balibar's Marx writes, the history of the process that produced capitalism on the, quote, basis of knowledge of its result, end quote. The materialism of the encounter for which die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist, also reasons backwards from the, quote, factum, the, quote, that is just how it is, and, quote, of existence. It does so, however, in the awareness that every fall stems from a, quote, fall, end quote, that endows a thing with an existence comprising an exception to the rule of that thing's non-existence. As capitalism is, in the book Anti-Oedipus, a, quote, amazing exception to the state of affairs in which free workers and money capital exist, quote, virtually, side by side, in a void defined by their non-encounter. Non-existence, in other words, is for the Althusser of 1973 the state in which a thing is normally held, so that its existence must be conceived as a result of the always exceptional encounter of elements whose surprising fusion fails to prevent it from appearing. Vivre sur l'impérialisme introduces this lesson in more familiar terms. Quote, in socialism, the condition for the non-existence of communism are all met, and therefore all to see. ... The conditions for the non-existence of communism are the still existing elements of the capitalist mode of production. ... As for those who think that the game has already been won, ... end quote, Althusser's conclusion, formulated as it happens on the 26th of August 1973, might be taken to mark the moment of his turn to aleatory materialism proper. Quote, the secret of the historical existence of existent modes of production, ... is to be sought less in the accomplished fact for the conditions of their existence than in the annulled, because non-accomplished fact of the conditions of non-existence of the same modes of production, for these conditions have sometimes been the death of them. It was about the same time that he declared that the programme commune was a lure. That is, perhaps, reason enough to read the first half of the present volume first. When all the evidence is in, the conclusion may well be that the battle for working-class dictatorship, chronicled in it, was fought from aleatory materialist positions, fully explained only in the second. And that's the end of the introduction to Philosophy of the Encounter, later writings 1978 to 1987 by Louis Althusser. I'm sorry to disappoint anybody that is super interested in that, but I'm just reading the introduction to this book. Thank you so much for listening. I learned some interesting things. I hope you did too.